The sun over the Arizona territory is a merciless god, demanding sweat and sanity as its tithe. At the mouth of Echo Canyon, where the scorched earth cracked like ancient pottery, the heat shimmers off Elias Thorne's anvil, creating a liquid mirage in the dry air. He feels the rhythm of his life in the shock that travels up his arm with every hammer blow, a solid, predictable force against the chaos he'd left behind. 4 or 5 years, this had been his world. The ring of steel, the hiss of hot iron in the quenching tub, the lonely howl of coyotes. He is a blacksmith, a man who beats metal into submission, and in doing so, quiets the forge of his own soul. Then he sees it, a flicker of movement by the sun-bleached rocks that guard the entrance to his canyon. Not a coyote, too still for that. Not a deer, wrong shape. He sets his hammer down, the sudden silence deafening. Wiping a grimy hand across his sweat-soaked brow, he squints against the glare. It's a heap of tattered buckskin and black hair, sprawled in the sliver of shade offered by a gnarled mesquite. He feels a cold knot tighten in his gut. He grabs his canteen, the sloshing of the water an obscene sound in the profound stillness. As he gets closer, the heap resolves into a person. A girl. An Apache girl. She is barely breathing, her lips cracked and bleeding, her dark eyes glassy and unfocused. She looks no older than 16 or 17, her body whittled down by thirst and heat until she is little more than bone and spirit. He kneels, his large frame casting a shadow over her. She flinches, a weak, animalistic reflex. Her hand twitches toward the knife sheath at her hip, but the effort is too great. Elias knows what she is. He knows what the men in Redemption Gulch, 10 miles east, would call her. A savage, a renegade, a menace to be dealt with. He knows that helping her is an invitation for trouble to ride right up to his door. He could turn around, go back to his forge, and in an hour, she would be just another mound in the dust. His solitude would be preserved, but he looks at her parched lips, at the faint, fluttering pulse in her throat, and sees not a savage, but a child dying in the dirt. He uncorks his canteen. Just a little, he murmurs, his voice rough from disuse, a gravelly sound he barely recognizes as his own. He tips the metal rim to her mouth, and a few drops of water spill onto her chin. And with that simple act of mercy, he unknowingly sets a new course for his life, a path that will lead either to his salvation or his destruction. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She was a ghost in his home, a wisp of a thing wrapped in one of his old wool blankets, lying on the cot in the corner of his one-room cabin. For 2 days, she did not speak. She barely moved, save to accept the small sips of water he offered, and later, the thin broth he spooned between her lips. Elias Thorne was a man unaccustomed to the presence of another human being, let alone one so fragile and freighted with danger. He moved about his small space with a clumsy awareness, his every action feeling loud and intrusive. The scrape of his chair, the clank of a pot, the heavy thud of his boots on the wooden floorboards, all seemed to desecrate the fragile silence she had brought within. His forge and cabin were built into the stony flank of Echo Canyon, a place chosen for its isolation. A steady spring seeped from the rock face further up, providing him with the water he needed for his work and his life, a rare blessing in this arid land. It was why he could exist here, away from the prying eyes and poisoned tongues of Redemption Gulch. Elias had come west to bury a life that had ended in a blur of fever and freshly turned earthback in Ohio. He had lost a wife, then a daughter, to a sickness that had swept through their town like a phantom reaper. The silence that followed had driven him from his home, from the faces of pitying neighbors, from the very air that seemed thick with memories. Here, the silence was different. It was clean, vast, a blank slate upon which he had intended to write nothing at all. Now that slate was marked. The girl, Nita, he would later learn she was called, was a living, breathing complication. On the 3rd day, she sat up, her eyes, though still hollowed out with exhaustion, had regained their focus. They followed him as he moved, dark and wary, like a hawk's. He had left a plate of beans and a piece of cornbread on a crate beside her cot. He worked at the forge all morning, the rhythmic clang of the hammer a familiar comfort. He shaped horseshoes, repaired a broken plowshare for a homesteader who lived a half-day's ride north, and tried not to think about the girl watching him from the cabin doorway. When he finally stopped, his back aching and his shirt plastered to his skin, he saw that the plate was empty. It was the first sign of life beyond mere survival. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She did not return it, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than before, a flicker of assessment in their depths. The town of Redemption Gulch was a festering sore on the landscape. It was a place built on flimsy hope and hard prejudice. Men came seeking gold and silver, and when they found none, they settled for nursing their resentments with cheap whiskey. The Apache were a favorite target of that resentment. They were ghosts in the hills, blamed for every missing cow, every spooked horse, every shadow that fell wrong. Elias made the trip to town only when absolutely necessary, for flour, salt, and steel. He timed his visits to avoid the worst of the saloon crowds, trading his wares and his silence for the goods he needed before melting back into the hills. He'd heard the talk. He'd seen the posters offering bounties for Apache scalps, and he knew the most venomous voice in town belonged to a man named Silas Croft. Croft was a rancher with more ambition than land, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had made it his personal crusade to cleanse the territory. Croft believed the canyons and mesas held mineral wealth, and he saw the Apache not just as a menace, but as an obstacle to his fortune. Elias had seen Croft in the general store once, holding court, his voice a confident boom. "They ain't human," Croft had declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that narrowly missed Elias's boot. "They're vermin, and you deal with vermin with traps and poison." The memory of those words made Elias's hand clench as he stacked firewood outside his cabin. He was harboring what Croft would call vermin, and Croft had a way of sniffing things out. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night, a storm rolled in. The sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a bruised purple. Wind howled through the canyon, rattling the cabin's single window and kicking up dust devils that danced like angry spirits. Elias built up the fire in the hearth, the flames pushing back against the encroaching dark. The girl, Nita, was huddled on the cot, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched the storm through the window, her expression unreadable. A powerful gust of wind tore at the roof, and a loose piece of tin sheeting began to bang and scrape with a hellish racket. It was the sound of something breaking, of a shelter failing. Before Elias could react, another gust ripped it free. The sheet of tin sailed through the air like a giant, deadly leaf, crashing against the rock wall near the spring. The rain began to pour then, a torrential downpour that turned the ground to mud in an instant. Elias grabbed his slicker. "Stay here," he grunted, the words more of an order than he intended. He had to secure the rest of the roof before it was torn to pieces. He fought against the wind and the lashing rain, his boots slipping in the mud. He clambered onto a stack of crates to reach the damaged section, his hammer in his belt. The wind was a physical force, trying to push him off his precarious perch. As he struggled to nail a spare plank over the hole, his foot slipped. He fell hard, his right arm scraping against the rough edge of the roof, opening a long, bloody gash from his wrist to his elbow. He swore, a sharp, guttural sound that was swallowed by the storm. He ignored the pain, finishing the repair before climbing down, soaked and bleeding. He stumbled back into the cabin, dripping water onto the floor. He slumped into a chair, the firelight glinting off the blood that ran down his arm. Nita was on her feet. She moved with a sudden, fluid grace that startled him. Before he could protest, she was beside him. She took his arm gently, her touch surprisingly firm. Her eyes weren't filled with fear of the storm, but with a focused intensity as she examined the wound. She disappeared for a moment into the darker corners of the cabin, then returned with a clean rag he used for polishing steel. She dipped it in the water bucket and began to clean the gash with methodical care. Her touch was light, but efficient. Then she did something that stunned him. She walked outside into the raging storm. "Hey," he shouted, starting to get up. "What are you doing?" She was back in a minute, her black hair plastered to her face, her hands full of leaves from a small, tough-looking bush that grew near the spring. He recognized it as something he'd always considered a weed. She crushed the leaves between two stones, creating a dark, fragrant pulp. Without a word of explanation, she began to pack the poultice into his wound. It stung at first, a clean, sharp pain, and then a soothing coolness spread through his arm. She tore a strip from the bottom of her own buckskin dress and wrapped it tightly around the poultice, securing it with a knot that was both simple and unshakable. When she was done, she stepped back. She looked at her handiwork, then at his face. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held a question. He flexed his fingers. The throbbing in his arm had already begun to subside. He looked at the makeshift bandage, then at her. For the first time, he saw not a helpless victim, but a person of profound and quiet competence. He saw the knowledge of the land that lived within her. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then retreated to her cot, pulling the blanket around her again. The storm raged on outside, but something inside the cabin had shifted. The space between them, once a chasm of fear and mistrust, now held a single, slender thread of connection, spun from a moment of shared crisis and unexpected care. The week that followed was one of quiet routine. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the desert floor dotted with the fleeting blooms of wildflowers. Elias worked, and Nita healed. She grew stronger each day, the hollows in her cheeks filling out, the light returning to her eyes. She began to take on small tasks around the cabin without being asked. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, she tidied his cluttered shelves, and she tended to the small patch of vegetables he kept near the spring, her hands moving with an innate understanding of growing things. They still barely spoke. Their communication was a language of gestures and shared space. He would leave a piece of jerky on the table for her. She would leave a neat pile of kindling by the hearth. He would watch her from the forge, marveling at the efficient way she moved, the way she seemed to belong to the landscape. She, in turn, would watch him work, her dark eyes following the mesmerizing dance of hammer and fire, a silent observer of his craft. He learned that her name was Nita because he heard her whisper it to herself one evening as she watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in fiery colors. One afternoon, a prospector named Jedediah, a grizzled man with more dust than gold in his beard, came rattling up the canyon in his rickety wagon. He needed a new pin for his axle. Elias was hammering out the piece when Jedediah ambled over to the cabin for a drink of water from his canteen. Nita was inside, grinding corn with a smooth stone. Jedediah peered through the open doorway. His eyes widened, and a slow, unpleasant grin spread across his face. Well, Thorne," he rasped, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Didn't take you for the type to be keeping company. Especially not that kind of company," he spat on the ground. "You best be careful. A man could get in a whole mess of trouble for harboring a redskin." Elias's hammer blows stopped. He turned slowly, the heavy forging hammer still held in his hand. He was a big man, his shoulders and arms corded with muscle from years of his trade, and when he stood to his full height, he cast a long shadow over the wiry prospector. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Jedediah, his gray eyes as hard and cold as iron. The grin on Jedediah's face faltered. He took a nervous step back, his eyes flicking from Elias's face to the hammer. "No offense intended," he mumbled, holding up his hands. "Just friendly advice is all." Elias walked to the anvil, picked up the hot, glowing axle pin with his tongs, and plunged it into the quenching tub. It hissed violently. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze never leaving the prospector. "The pin's done," he said, his voice flat. "That'll be 4 bits." Jedediah fumbled in his pouch, his hands shaking slightly. He tossed the coins onto the anvil and scurried back to his wagon, not even waiting for the pin to cool completely. He yanked it from the tub with a pair of pliers, jammed it into his axle, and whipped his mule into a trot, disappearing down the canyon in a cloud of dust. Elias stood watching until he was gone. The peace of his sanctuary had been breached. He knew with a cold certainty that Jedediah would not keep his mouth shut. The prospector's fear would curdle into bravado the second he reached the saloon in Redemption Gulch. The story would grow with each telling. The quiet blacksmith in the canyon wasn't just a loner. He was an Indian lover. The clock had started ticking. He went inside the cabin. Nita was standing by the cot, her back ramrod straight. The stone she'd been using to grind corn lay on the floor. She had heard everything. The wariness was back in her eyes, brighter and sharper than ever. She looked at him, then at the door, a cornered animal searching for an escape route. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, to offer some reassurance, but the words wouldn't come. Lies did not sit well with him. Instead, he simply went to the hearth, picked up the corn-grinding stone, and placed it back on the small table beside her. He met her gaze, held it for a long moment, and then returned to his forge. The ringing of his hammer filled the canyon once more, but now it sounded different. It was no longer the sound of solitude. It was the sound of defiance. The news Jedediah carried to Redemption Gulch spread like a brush fire. 2 days later, Elias saw the dust cloud on the horizon long before he heard the horses. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting them. He sent Nita into the cabin and told her to stay out of sight, then stood by his anvil, his arms crossed over his broad chest, waiting. 3 riders emerged from the shimmering heat. The man in the middle was Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, always bending to the will of the most powerful voice in town. To his right was Silas Croft, his expensive hat and tailored coat a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He rode his horse with an air of ownership, as if the very canyon belonged to him. The third man was a grim-faced deputy. They reined in their horses a few yards from the forge. Croft's eyes swept over the place with undisguised contempt, lingering on the small garden Nita had been tending. "Thorne," Sheriff Miller began, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "We've had a report. A disturbing report." "That's so," Elias said, his voice level. It was Croft who answered, cutting the sheriff off. "Don't play coy with us, Blacksmith. Jedediah says he saw an Apache squaw in your cabin. We've had livestock go missing over at the Miller place. There was a raid on a supply wagon 2 weeks back. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive." Jedediah was drunk, Elias stated flatly. He saw a shadow, and his guilty conscience did the rest. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A guilty conscience? No, I think he saw exactly what he said he saw. This land has a disease, Thorne, and people who help spread it are just as sick. Now, we're going to have a look inside your cabin." Elias didn't move. He simply unfolded his arms. "This is my property, Croft. You're not searching anything without a warrant signed by a judge." The sheriff blanched. "Now, Elias, let's not be difficult." "He's right, Sheriff," Croft sneered, his eyes glittering with malice. "He knows his rights. But let me tell you something, Blacksmith. Rights don't mean much out here when your neighbors decide they don't like you. When they decide you're a traitor to your own kind." He leaned forward in his saddle. "I know what you are. You're one of those who thinks these savages are people. You sit out here, thinking you're better than us. But you're not. You're just a coward, hiding from the world." Elias felt a cold rage building inside him, a pressure he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his wife's face, pale against her pillow. He thought of his little girl's hand in his. He had run from that pain, from the world that had taken them. Maybe Croft was right. Maybe he was a coward. But looking at the smug, cruel face of the rancher, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever he was not like Silas Croft. "Get off my land," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Croft's smirk widened. "We'll go. For now. But we'll be back. And when we come back, we won't be asking so politely. You think about that. You think about which side you're on." He wheeled his horse around, the deputy and the sheriff following in his wake. They rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension hanging in the air. Elias watched them go, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The confrontation was over, but the war had just been declared. He turned and went back inside. Nita was standing exactly where he had left her, but she was holding something in her hand, his old hunting rifle. She hadn't been cowering in the corner. She had been ready to fight. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, and he saw a flicker of the same defiance he felt in his own heart. He took the rifle from her gently. "It's all right," he said, and this time he almost believed it. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of alliance. They sat at the small table, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time, she spoke in a halting mixture of her own language and the few English words she knew, telling him about being separated from her people during a buffalo hunt that was ambushed by soldiers. She had been running for days, lost and alone, when she finally collapsed at the mouth of his canyon. He found himself telling her about his past, the words coming out rusty and stiff at first, then flowing more easily as he spoke of the life he had lost. He told her about his daughter, Sarah, who had hair as black as hers and who loved to watch him work at his forge back in Ohio. He spoke of the emptiness that had followed her death, an emptiness so vast it had swallowed his world. As he spoke, he saw not pity in Nita's eyes, but a deep, solemn understanding. She had known loss too. She had seen her own people suffer. In the heart of that desolate canyon, two people from different worlds, a disgraced blacksmith and a hunted Apache girl, found a common ground in their shared grief. He realized with a jolt that the thought of her leaving, of her finding her people and disappearing from his life, now brought a sharp, unexpected pang of loss. The quiet solitude he had once cherished now seemed like a barren prison. Her presence had filled the cracks in his broken life, and he was terrified of being left alone with the pieces again. A few days later, Nita made a decision. She had seen the way Croft looked at Elias. She understood the danger she had brought to his doorstep. One morning, before the sun had risen, she slipped out of the cabin. She carried a small bundle with a piece of dried meat and a skin of water. She would not be the cause of his destruction. Elias woke to an unfamiliar stillness. The cabin felt hollow, empty. He saw her cot was empty, the blanket folded neatly. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, washed over him. He burst out of the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scanned the canyon, his eyes darting back and forth. He saw her tracks in the dust, leading east toward the open desert. He didn't even stop to saddle his horse. He just ran. He was a strong man, and fear gave his legs wings. He followed her trail, his boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. He caught up to her within a mile. She was walking with a steady, determined pace, her back to him. "Nita," he yelled. She stopped but didn't turn around. Her shoulders were rigid. He came to stop a few feet behind her. He was breathing heavily, more from fear than exertion. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice raw. "I go," she said, her voice small. "You are safe then." "Safe?" he repeated, stepping in front of her so she had to look at him. "You think I'll be safe if Croft comes back and finds you gone? He won't believe you just left. He'll think I killed you and hid your body. He'll tear my home apart looking for you, and when he doesn't find you, he'll probably hang me just for the trouble." He wasn't sure if it was true, but he would say anything to make her stay. She looked at the ground, her face a mask of misery. "I bring trouble." He reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. Your trouble is my trouble now. We're in this together." The words came from a place deep inside him he thought had died long ago. A place of connection, of responsibility, of care. "This place," he said, gesturing back toward the canyon. "This is your home, if you'll have it." Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. They traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't speak, but she gave a single, sharp nod. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good," he said gruffly, trying to hide the profound relief that flooded him. "Now let's go home." As they walked back to the canyon, the rising sun cast their long shadows before them, two solitary figures walking side by side, no longer alone. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would protect her with his life. He was no longer just a blacksmith hiding from his ghosts. He was a man with something to fight for. The ultimatum came, as Elias knew it would. It wasn't delivered by Croft this time, but officially by Sheriff Miller. He rode out alone, his face pale and sweating, looking like a man on his way to his own hanging. He carried a piece of paper, a formal notice from the so-called Town Council of Redemption Gulch, which was little more than a mouthpiece for Silas Croft. "Elias, I'm sorry," the sheriff mumbled, refusing to meet his eye. "My hands are tied." Croft got everyone whipped into a frenzy. "They're talking about forming a vigilance committee." Elias took the paper. The crude lettering was clear enough. He had 24 hours to surrender the Apache fugitive to the custody of a sheriff. If he failed to comply, a posse would be dispatched to his property to take her by force and to arrest him for aiding and abetting a hostile. 24 hours, Elias, Miller repeated, his voice pleading. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just give her up. It's for the best." Elias crumpled the notice in his fist. "The best for who? Miller? For you? For Croft?" He looked at the sheriff with pure contempt. "Get out of here." Sheriff Miller didn't need to be told twice. He turned his horse and galloped away, eager to escape the suffocating weight of his own cowardice. Elias went back inside the cabin. He smoothed the crumpled paper out on the table. Nita came and stood beside him, reading the words. She showed no fear, only a grim resolve. They were out of time. They couldn't run. The desert would kill them long before the posse found them. They couldn't fight. It would be 2 against a dozen or more. They were trapped. He sank into a chair, the weight of their impossible situation pressing down on him. He had faced loss and grief, but he had never faced hopelessness like this. He had failed. He had brought her into his home only to lead her to a cage or a rope. It was Nita who broke the silence. She touched the crumpled paper, then looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. She began to speak, not in the broken English she used with him, but in her own tongue, the words flowing like water. She pointed to the canyon walls, to the high ridges that surrounded them, to the sky. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was talking about her people. Then she switched to English, speaking slowly and deliberately, choosing her words with care. "My people are close. They hunt in the mountains," she pointed north. "They do not know I am here. They think I am lost dead." She walked to the hearth and picked up a piece of charcoal. On a flat, smooth stone, she drew a symbol, a spiral with a feathered arrow pointing through it. "This is a sign for my brother. If he sees it, he will know." "Ow!" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. "How can we make him see it?" She looked at the high, flat-topped butte at the far end of the canyon, a landmark visible for miles. "A fire," she said, "on the high rock, at sunrise. But not just a fire, a smoke that speaks." She explained her plan. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. They would have to climb the butte in the dark. They would need specific materials, green branches to make a thick, dark smoke, and a wet blanket to control it, to send it up in the specific puffs and patterns that formed a message her people might recognize. It was a language of smoke, a prayer sent to the sky. Hope, fragile and thin, began to push back against the despair in Elias's chest. It was a chance. It might be their only one. "All right," he said, his voice firm again. "Let's get to work." The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. They didn't barricade the door. That would be useless. Instead, they gathered their supplies. Elias cut the greenest branches from the mesquite and greasewood bushes, his axe swinging with a renewed purpose. Nita packed dried meat, his last handful of cornmeal, and the water skins. They were preparing not for a siege, but for a pilgrimage. As dusk fell, a profound quiet settled over the canyon. They sat by the fire, the tools of their desperate plan lying ready by the door. The tension was a living thing in the small cabin, a third presence at their table. To break it, he found himself talking, telling her more about his daughter, Sarah, about how she used to collect colorful stones and call them her treasures. Nita listened, and then she told him of her own family. Her father, a clan leader named Cochise. Her brother, Tazi, a young warrior who had taught her to track and to read the signs of the land. She spoke of her mother, who wove blankets that told the stories of their people. As she spoke, the ghosts of their pasts filled the small cabin, not as specters of grief, but as a silent council of witnesses, their shared humanity a flickering light against the encroaching darkness. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression serene despite the peril that awaited them. The raw-boned, half-dead girl he had found in the dust was gone. In her place was a woman of incredible strength and quiet dignity. He knew, in that moment, that his life was now inextricably bound to hers. He had not bought a laborer. He had not rescued a victim. He had found a partner. Hours before dawn, they set out. The moon was a pale sliver, providing little light. Elias carried the heavy bundle of green branches and the wet blanket, his muscles straining under the load. Nita led the way, moving through the darkness with a sure-footed grace that amazed him. She seemed to read the terrain with her feet, her path weaving through the treacherous scree and thorny brush of the canyon floor. The climb up the butte was grueling. The path was steep and treacherous, little more than a game trail. Twice, Elias slipped, the heavy bundle threatening to pull him off the narrow ledge. Each time, Nita's small, strong hand was there, steadying him, guiding him. They climbed in silence, their labored breathing the only sound in the vast, sleeping world. They reached the flat top just as the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern horizon. They were exhausted, their clothes torn, their hands and faces scratched. But they had made it. The view was breathtaking. The world spread out below them, a rumpled blanket of canyons and mesas stretching to the horizon. Redemption Gulch was a tiny, insignificant smudge in the distance. They worked quickly. Elias built a small pyre with the dry wood he had carried, while Nita laid out the green branches. When the fire was burning steadily, she took the wet blanket. This was her part now. He stood back and watched as she began her work. As the sun's first rays broke over the distant mountains, she threw the green branches onto the fire. A thick column of dark smoke billowed into the still morning air. She took the blanket, and with a rhythmic, practiced motion, she began to cover and uncover the fire. She was not just making smoke, she was shaping it, carving it. A long puff, then 2 short ones. A pause, 3 short puffs. It was a code, a conversation with the empty sky. She worked for what felt like an eternity, her face set in deep concentration, her body moving in a graceful, urgent dance. Elias scanned the horizon, his eyes straining, searching for any sign, any answer. He saw nothing but the endless expanse of the desert. The sun climbed higher, and the smoke began to thin as their green branches were consumed. Despair began to creep back into his heart. It hadn't worked. They were alone. Then he heard it, the distant sound of horses. It was coming from the direction of town. He looked down and saw a plume of dust rising from the mouth of his canyon. The posse. They were early. Croft's impatience had won out. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Nita stopped, letting the blanket fall. She looked at the approaching dust cloud, her face impassive. She had done all she could. She turned to Elias, a deep sadness in her eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through her own. "We faced them together." They stood on the edge of the butte, hand in hand, watching as the posse rode into the canyon below. They were a swarm of angry hornets, about 15 of them, led by Croft and the sheriff. They surrounded his small cabin, their shouts echoing faintly up to the high rock. This was the end, but as he stood there, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, he felt not fear, but a strange sense of peace. He had not run. He had not hidden. He had made a stand. Just as Croft dismounted and strode toward the cabin door, a new sound cut through the morning air. It was a single, piercing cry, high and sharp, that seemed to come from the very rocks around them. It was a sound that made the hairs on Elias's arms stand on end. Croft and his men froze. They looked up, their arrogant expressions melting away into confusion, then into stark, naked fear. Elias followed their gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. The canyon walls, which moments before had been empty, sun-baked rock, were now alive. On every ridge, every outcropping, on both sides of the canyon, stood the silent figures of Apache warriors. They had materialized from the stone itself, a glittering, deadly frieze against the morning sky. There were not just a few scouts. There were dozens of them, maybe more than 50. They stood motionless, armed with rifles and bows, their faces streaked with the stark patterns of war paint. They held the high ground, their strategic placement perfect, their presence an overwhelming statement of power. The posse was caught in a trap. The hunters had, in an instant, become the hunted. The boisterous confidence of the townsmen evaporated, replaced by a terrified silence. The men sat frozen on their horses, their eyes wide, their hands hovering nervously near their guns, knowing any move would be their last. On the highest ridge, directly opposite the butte where Elias and Nita stood, one warrior stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded authority. Nita's grip on Elias's hand tightened. "Tazi," she breathed. Her brother. Tazi did not look at the posse, trapped below. His eyes were fixed on the butte, on his sister. Nita raised her hand, and he raised his in return. She called out to him, her voice clear and strong in her own language, the words echoing across the canyon. He replied, his voice a powerful baritone that resonated with authority. Then Tazi turned his gaze to Elias. He looked at the big, disheveled white man standing beside his sister at their joined hands. He held Elias's gaze for a long, silent moment. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of threat, but one of acknowledgement, a sign of respect, a debt recognized. He barked a command, and as silently and suddenly as they had appeared, the warriors began to melt back into the landscape. They did not retreat. They simply vanished, becoming one with the rocks and shadows, their ghostly presence lingering long after they were gone. Down below, the spell was broken. Silas Croft, his face the color of ash, scrambled back onto his horse. He didn't look back. He didn't say a word. He spurred his mount into a frantic gallop, and the rest of his posse, their courage shattered, turned and fled in a panicked, disorderly rout, their only thought to escape the haunted canyon. In a matter of moments, they were gone. The canyon was silent again, save for the gentle morning breeze. Elias and Nita were left standing alone on the butte, the dust of the departed posse settling far below. He looked down at his forge, his small cabin, his home. It was safe. She was safe. He finally let out the breath he had been holding for an eternity and felt the tension drain from his body, leaving him weak-kneed with relief. He looked at Nita. The sun caught the tears of joy on her cheeks, making them sparkle like diamonds. He let his heavy, calloused hand fall from hers and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The journey down the butte was made in a reverent quiet. When they reached the bottom, standing before the cabin that had become their fortress, he looked at her. The transaction of a few sips of water for a life had been repaid 1,000-fold. But it was no longer about debts or transactions. What stood between them now was a bond forged in defiance, tempered in fear, and solidified by a faith in each other that transcended worlds. She looked up at him, her dark eyes full of a light he had never seen before, and she smiled. And for the first time in more than 5 years, a genuine, unburdened smile touched the lips of Elias Thorne. The canyon walls were just rock again, but they both knew, with absolute certainty, that they would never truly be alone again. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.